Please join me in giving Roy Wenzl a warm Pachyderm Club welcome.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm now going to tell you what else I am, or what I might be. I'm going to address the elephant, well, maybe the llama in the room, which is that this is the Pachyderm Club and I'm a newspaper reporter. So here's what I've been called by people: liberal, Hillary lover, communist, Stalinist. I don't know what that means. Does that mean I want to send intellectuals to chop wood in Siberia? I don't know what that means. Baby killer, I know what that means. Traitor, snowflake, wearer of pink underwear. And the first wave of people who accused me of being these things were, of course, members of my own family. Mostly conservative people from north central Kansas, farmers. I can prove, regarding these allegations, I can prove to you right now, if you want, that I do not wear pink underwear. No? Okay. I'll go there if you want. So here's what else. I told my brothers one time, you didn't even ask me a question. You just assumed that because I became a newspaper reporter that I'm something. You did not ask questions, you just made statements. And that kind of struck home with them a little bit. So they felt guilty for about 5 seconds and then started calling me names again. But here's a little bit of the rest of it. I own guns. My first wife and I, she homeschooled our kids for 13 years. That's not exactly a liberal thing. And we heard liberals griping at us, how could you possibly be socializing your children? And I said, well, I learned the F word in the first grade in public school. I didn't pronounce it right. I'm going to make sure that they pronounce it right at home. Farmer's son, went to work at age 6, and that is not fake news. That is, that's what farmer kids do, especially when they have 7,000 chickens and they like to lay eggs and mom wants the eggs. So from age 6, 7 days a week, sometimes 16-hour days in the harvest time, I've had a paying job and paid taxes since 1976. My grandfather, my mother's father, was killed in action in World War II fighting the Germans. So that's, I get what my point about all of this is. Sometimes I think in this country now we've become so divided that we just fall back on cliches and generalizations about people, and that's, liberals do it too. It's never a good idea when you do it. I was something of a flaming liberal in college. Wrote editorials, for example, denouncing the death penalty. But my first job right after I got out of college was at the Kansas City Star, and I covered a murder trial where a 17-year-old weightlifting kid beat an 88-year-old great-grandmother to death with her own iron skillet after raping her. And after that, I was not so much a flaming liberal about the death penalty. And after that, I did some soul searching, and I told myself, I wonder what else I've gotten wrong up to this point. Another thing that many of us don't do anymore, we don't question ourselves and go, am I really I'm so full of myself, which my brothers also tell me. I've learned to kind of test myself once in a while. So I don't think, I'm not griping about it, but I don't think a lot of the things that are said about the news media is accurate. But people have their opinions and they're entitled to them. I believe in the First Amendment. I think we do a lot of good in this town. I think because of us, even though there's not many of us left, I think City Hall and other government entities are just a little bit more honest, not because we're there hovering over them, but because they know that once in a while one of our folks is going to delve in. So I think there's a tendency, because of that, to err on the side of, well, let's not take a shortcut here. So anyway, enough about that. And now I'll segue into what I've learned about the homeless in this town, and some of it is pretty heartbreaking. I'll just give away one of the points I'm going to try to make, which is a lot of people today say things about things without having any experience with those things. So there are therefore a lot of assumptions about conservatives by liberals or liberals by conservatives. There are assumptions about who the homeless are. There are assumptions, somewhat correct, but also glaringly incorrect about who the poor are, including in our town. So here's what happened. In the year 2000, the photographer at the Eagle who's still there, Fernando Salazar, comes to me and says, I got this great story. Come along. There's these two former drug dealers, PCP and cocaine as I recall, who had found Jesus together in prison and had decided to do good. So they formed what they called the Biker Ministry, and they became a food pantry in this town. This was, as I said, in the year 2000. And they looked like Confederate Army generals. They had the long beards, also had tattoos and quite a history. They kind of looked at me funny when I said, can I have your social security numbers and your, so on. Well, why do you want that? Because I'm going to look you up. I'm not just going to take your word for it that what you're telling me. So I looked up their prison records, and yeah, they were telling me the truth. I went out there, and I decided this is not going to be one or two interviews in a cloud of dust. There was a long line of poor people on this day that they handed out boxes of food that they got from the food bank. And I went out there and started going up and down the line talking to these people because it occurred to me I don't want to just do a quickie story here. I want to figure out who the poor are in Wichita, who they really are. About the second or third day I was doing this, I'm driving to the Biker Ministry. I don't remember anymore where it was, but it was the year 2000, and I had the radio in my car tuned to a news station, and Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich were trying to work out welfare reform. And I don't remember how that turned out either because I'm old and my memory's fading, but I do remember that the story I heard was that Gallup or somebody had done a national poll of American citizens asking who are the poor. And overwhelmingly the response was they are black people. Well, and then they pointed out in the news story that that is incorrect, that by far the majority of poor people are white people, and in fact the biggest segments of poor people in this country are children and elderly. Well, I'm not here to stand up and say that you should feel bad about this and so on. I'm here to say that I went, damn, what a fool I am. I just went out and interviewed people for 2 days and didn't even bother to register, even in my own mind, what color they are or what their backgrounds are. And here I am trying to do a story about who the poor are in Wichita. So I arrived at the Biker Ministry just minutes later, and I started looking at the long line. And they were mostly white people and mostly elderly on that day. There were a few kids. And I went, I wonder what else I've got wrong in life, including how I started doing this story. So then I branched out. I went to the food bank, and I asked them who the poor are. And I told them about the Gallup poll or whatever it was. And they said in their experience, most of the poor people in town are white people, and many of them are elderly, and there's a lot of children. And they said the best place you can go to figure out a lot of this stuff is the Bread of Life food pantry, which 17 years later still exists. They've been around for a quarter of a century now, handing out boxes of food once a week, and they do the big turkey thing. Thanksgiving week, they hand out like 1,500, 2,000 turkeys, and there's a line that starts at midnight, and they just stand there, and by the time the place opens at 6, there's like a couple of thousand people standing in line, including if it's freezing cold and raining. So I went down there, and I've been going back off and on to the Bread of Life ever since. And there's several reasons I like to do that. Here's one reason. It's all done by a tiny little church. I think it's called Living Word. And I started asking, who are you folks? Donna Piner is the current executive director of the Bread of Life, and she's a member of that church, of course. And she and the rest of them down there said, well, we're mostly very conservative. Very few, most of our congregation is white, and most of them are on the low end of the economic scale, very low end. And yet, so I said, well, where's all the resources and the money coming from? to feed all these thousands of people that they're handing out tons of food every year. And they said, well, we've gotten pretty good at writing away for grants, but there's times when we're $10,000 short for the Thanksgiving thing, and so we just show up at church, and pretty soon we've got the money. So that's how they do that. They also said that they're mostly very conservative, politically and socially. Whenever I've gone down there, I now raise the political question, and nothing's changed in my time with the Bread of Life. They never had any use for Hillary. They never had any use for Barack Obama. And yet they're doing something that some people criticize people for. You're just giving away food, and that's just going to create more need. Well, that's not their view of it. They're also very Bible-based, and so they read deep in both Testaments, including and especially all the stuff about helping the poor that the New Testament talks about, especially in the 4 Gospels, and they think it's their God-given command to try to help these people. I love going down there for one reason, and that is whenever I write a story, it helps me write a story that gives the lie to one of those generalizations that all conservatives, see, it's a generalization, are heartless and don't care. There's no people that care more than that bunch down there. They give and give and give. Some of these people with very low incomes that are, a little bit above the poverty line give thousands of dollars to this effort every year. That's just amazing. But here's what else they do, and this is another reason I like to go down there and write about them. They object to the notion of the generalizations about the poor in our community, such as that they're all this or all that they're all lazy, for example. They're all drug addicts. They're all that kind of thing. When they hear this, it hurts them. It hurts these people who are giving because they don't just hand out the boxes. Anybody who shows up as a first-timer has to sit down for an hour or so with somebody, a volunteer from the Bread of Life, and get questioned. Who are you? What's your phone number? What are you doing to find work? Can we help you find work? Here's some brochures. Do you have illnesses in your family? Can we help with that? Do you have mental illnesses? Here's some brochures to help you with that. And they don't let them show up every week. That's why they take the names. You can show up once a month, that's fine, but if you try to repeat and repeat, we're trying to create incentives here for you. So I love that. But in questioning them, year after year, whenever I've gone down there, I raise the question again. They say, well, there are some drunks, and I've been there in the morning sometimes, and once in a while interviewing somebody in line, I go, whew. I went to college, so I know a little bit about what people look like when they're high. Once in a while I run into that, but most of these people are stone cold sober, and what the Bread of Life will tell you is that the majority of the people who stand in those long lines week after week, many of them are working people where both mom and dad have jobs. Now, how can this be? Well, here's another story that seems like it's a tangent, but one of the things I did that I just loved about 10 years ago or so was I hung out for a couple of days with Phil Ruffin when he still lived here. And I did a profile of him. And I don't know if he still has this property, but he took me into one of his factories. He was so proud about this. It's a factory that was in Wichita where he made furniture. And it was like those video, where you've seen the videos how they make cars now, where the robot arms are going like this. That's what it was. And I went, whoa. And he was so proud of this. He says, look at all these robots. Boy, that really cuts down on the bottom line. But the thought occurred to me, well, okay, furniture makers used to be people, hands-on, and in the last half century before that, they were probably people who had full-time jobs and benefits, vacation and health and so on, and those jobs are gone. Automation has wiped out a lot of jobs and hollowed out a lot of the middle class. You can argue that that's the fault of a political group, but I don't think that, I mean, and there probably is something to that, but boy, automation, just as one example, the farm I grew up on, about 10 miles south of us, my dad's cousin, Dean Diedrich, runs this vast operation. And he's still just a family farmer. He and his two sons. He told me one time that when he grew up with his dad, it was just him and his dad on the farm. Now he and his sons run that farm plus 15 more. And that's because of the tractors got a lot bigger and more efficient. All the machinery got a lot better. They're talking now about drone farming, where instead of going out to check the cattle like my farmer brother still does, you can just send out a drone and count the calves in the spring in the pasture and make sure that they're all right and that they're all there. The coyotes haven't grabbed a couple of them. Automation's really done some things, so I'm not trying to make excuses or make a case or anything. I'm just saying, wow, how could you end up with all these people showing up week after week at the Bread of Life and all the other food pantries in town? Well, so I've written about that. I love the Bread of Life stories because, again, here's a whole bunch of people. If you generalized about Republicans and conservatives in general, there ain't no better bunch of people in this town than those people. They are hardcore servants of God with actions and not just showing up at church and throwing something into the collection plate. They also object to the notion that the people that they serve week after week, year after year, are all this or all that, because they've actually come in contact with them for a quarter of a century now. So eventually I started branching out, ended up talking to a school official one day and started doing stories. This was about, I guess, 10 years ago or so, about the homeless kids in schools. And at first I didn't believe what I was hearing. 1,000, almost 1,000 at that time. They're actually, I just checked, and the school officials got with me today just before I walked in here. They're more than halfway through the school year, and they've got 1,800. For a couple of years now, it's been up closer, above 2,000. A little boring part here about numbers. When they do that count of homeless, when the United Way organizes that count of the homeless, their numbers turn up about 500 people. So how come you've got 1,000 or 1,500 or 2,000 kids in the schools? It's because the United Way, until recently, was going with numbers designated by HUD. And that means anybody who is on the streets or in a shelter is homeless, and that's who we count. The Department of Education defines homelessness differently. Anybody who is in a shelter, on the streets, or doubling up, as they call it, or living in a motel. Those people have a roof over their heads, right? So you could argue, well, they're not really homeless. Except that the way it actually works is the roof over their head is usually at first a relative when they go belly up and go homeless, and the relative gets tired of them after 3 days or 2 weeks, and there's either a big fight or a kind of a, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to ask you to leave conversation. So then they go to another relative's house, same thing happens, and then they go to somebody else, a friend of a friend, and eventually it's a kind of a serious situation. And it doesn't have to be because they're rambunctious or rip up the furniture or anything. It's just, you know what I mean. When you have extra people in the house, it's like, man. So the thing that the Department of Education worries about with kids like that is that the disruption is pretty serious. And they decided to go with these guidelines because they regard it as homelessness because of the kids' lives are so disrupted. Every 2 weeks or every 3 days, they're sleeping in some different bed, sometimes in somebody's basement. At first, when the school district started encountering these numbers years ago, they would just go, well, okay, they're homeless. But then they decided, we got to impose some sort of a program here, and this was a national thing and not just a 259 thing, where we figure out how to keep, no matter where the kid is sleeping at night, the kid goes to the same school all school year so that we can cut down on this disruption. So with federal grants and local money, they've figured out a way how to patch that together, but it's more expensive than just a regular kid showing up at school because they've got to keep track of scheduling, No matter what part of town the kid's in, the kid is still bused, and so on. So it's a difficult thing. And they too, at the school district, in direct contact with all these people, say the same thing that the Bread of Life people say, that the majority of these people are working people. They're working at McDonald's, or they're working at some place where it's very low wage, but they're just not making enough. Or there's a lot of people with a lot of medical bills nowadays, so if you get that has made a lot of people homeless. The huge rise in healthcare costs have put a lot of people out on the streets. So I really started digging into this. I did what I always do. I started talking to some of these homeless people, including parents. I did a story, and this is why Mr. Todd invited me here today. I did 3 or 4 stories in November, December, revolving around a woman that I'd found named Heidi. Didn't want her last name used, but she was living in her pickup truck with her 3 kids. And so I didn't just take the school district's word for what was happening to her. I arranged to meet her. She was sleeping at truck stops because there's a lot less likelihood that she's going to get rousted and told to move on at 3 o'clock in the morning with her kids in the car. So she actually showed up at the Eagle on a moment's notice. I called and said, hey, when can we get together? She said, well, I happen to be on Douglas Avenue right now, so I know she didn't set up what I'm about to describe to you. So she shows up 5 minutes later in the Eagle parking lot in her blue pickup truck, and I go out to meet her, and it is freezing cold. And she gets the kids out of the car. 2 of them, she has 3, but she had 2 of them at that time. They're both young enough to be in car seats, and they're in the back seat. As they pulled up, I could see that the 2 kids in the back seat are up to their necks in belongings, especially blankets, coats, all the stuff, bags. Below the coats are all the bags with the food, the belongings, whatever they can carry. And I had a heck of a time getting Heidi to talk to me because she didn't want to seem like she needed anything. And the cool thing about it is she had a full-time job. How does somebody with a full-time, how can you possibly have a full-time job and be homeless like that with no place to go? So she explained that after her longtime boyfriend and father of these 2 youngsters had dumped her, that she had tried to patch things together and said, I'm not that good at household finances, so I just kept promising the landlord that I would find a way to pay. And her job as a security guard just didn't pay that much, so she ended up running up a heck of a debt and getting on some sort of list. And I'm not an expert on these lists, but if you do that to landlords in this town, you're going to end up on some sort of a list where no one will allow you to rent an apartment. So she also was so rigid about, I don't want help, I don't want charity, I don't even know if I want to talk to you. I finally, because I don't want to seem like I'm just asking for handouts. It took me a couple of weeks to talk her into things, and I finally talked her into it by saying, haven't you run into other people in kind of similar situations to you? Yeah, I've run into plenty. Well, I'm not, I'll read you the darn paragraphs of this, the key paragraphs of the story so you feel comfortable, but I'm not going to make you look like a fool or like some sort of mooch, and maybe the story will trigger something, which it did. So she goes, well, okay, if it'll help others, fine. So I did that story, I did a second story, and then when I came at her again, she said, I don't want to talk to you anymore. You're a nice guy, but I'm done trying to be homeless anymore in your newspaper. Shortly after that, she had piled up enough money from living in a pickup truck and cutting down on expenses that she paid off the debt, got off the list, and she's now living in an apartment. And all sorts of people, because of those 3 stories, 2 stories, I guess, called up, called the school district, called me, and donated, got her into a hotel. This was around Christmas time, got her into a hotel for the whole holiday season. And if you remember, that was just really bad weather and freezing cold. The way she kept them alive during weather like that previous to that was she'd wake up every 2 hours and turn the pickup on until the heat permeated the cab, and then she'd shut it off to save gas. So you see things like that, and because we really do try hard to be professionals at the Eagle, we really do try to be objective. We don't try to write preachy sermons. We really don't try to do that, but it's heartbreaking. Several times, there was one day early on when I showed up to look at these lines of people in the year 2000. It was a biker ministry and at the Bread of Life, where I saw 3 people who were grandmothers, and it was actually one of them was a great-grandmother, and in one hand, this elderly lady standing in line for hours has the handle of one of those little tiny two-wheel carts with an oxygen bottle on it, with the plastic running up to her, attached to her head, running into her nose, and in the other hand, she's got the hand of a child. That sticks, I've done probably thousands of stories now, and most of them, once I'm done, they start to float out of my head, and I barely remember most of them. I'm never going to get those sights out of my head. The other thing you see is when you show up at the turkey thing at the Bread of Life in the Thanksgiving week, and that long, long line. This last November, it was not only a long line, but it was a sunny day, and it was just freezing, freezing cold. And I counted 30 kids in that line. The mamas and the parents were taking good care of them because they were all bundled up, so that all you could see was this much of their face. They all had coats, they all had mittens, but they'd been standing on the concrete for so long that all of them were doing what I used to do on the farm on those cold days. They were pounding their feet into the concrete to try to get blood flow going, 6 years old, 4 years old, that kind of thing. That's a tough thing. How do you deal with that? Well, I've spent so many years talking to people, including Charles Koch, 6 or 7 times now, David Koch, other people who I deeply admire and respect. And so Fran Jabera, if anybody remembers who he was, the accounting professor for 40 years, he used to mentor me. For 2 years, every Saturday, 3 or 4 hours a Saturday, he'd mentor me about business. He was no liberal, let me tell you. So I learned how to write business stories from him because I didn't have the background to understand it. I'd never run a business like him. And I can write pretty fair business stories now and be, so it doesn't make me look like a fool in the business community. So I understand that you can't just throw money at problems. I think that's a bad idea. But you can't throw generalizations at situations either. I mean, I think that's a big mistake. So what can we do about this? Well, I'm no expert at that either. I do know there's a guy in town named Barry Downing. Does everybody kind of know who he is? Grew up poor in Hayesville. He's now a multi-millionaire. So he has given to all sorts of charities in town some pretty big numbers. He grew up in direct contact with the poor because he was one of them. He told me that he would duck down, and when his dad was driving him around in Hayesville, he would duck down under so nobody could see inside the car that he was in there because he was so embarrassed about how he looked and the clothes, the cheap patched clothes that he wore. And so he knew poverty from the inside out. So if you've ever heard of the TOP program, this was something he created about 10, 12 years ago. There's these 3 or 4 schools where he grabs kids early, especially poor kids, and he essentially underwrites a lot of their preschool education, hires really good qualified people to do this, and then hired a bunch of experts to follow these kids through grade school, middle school, and high school, and I believe them. They say to him and to us whenever I've done a story that this does remarkable things. They come to school knowing how to read, knowing how to do math and not be afraid of it. So it cuts down on a young person's frustration level, including poor kid frustration when they're already poor and yanked around. So there are things that are being done. I think they're all admirable. what Barry Downing does in doing that is he's trying to figure out how to break the poverty cycle. You can't break the poverty cycle with platitudes and generalities. You aren't going to cut the poverty cycle by completely cutting these people off either. So he has done, I think, a remarkable thing. By the way, he doesn't just give away stuff. Any parent that's involved with the TOP program, there are expectations about how often they're going to show up at the school to talk to the teachers. In other words, and there's other things that he insists that they do, so it's not just some sort of giveaway. They have to earn their right to keep their kid in this program. He doesn't like Barack Obama either, or Hillary, but he's found a way to try to break the cycle. The terrible thing, the thing I'm here to kind of warn you about is as these populations continue to grow, especially all these thousands of kids every year, is that there's despair, there's a lack of learning, and so they perpetuate this into adulthood. Barry's kids, I suspect, I'm going to try to stay around journalism long enough to delve into how all of this turns out on a big scale, but I don't think Barry Downing's kids are going to end up quite like that. Some of them might, but I think that's something pretty good. As far as what you all can do, if you want to, you can consider, giving that's really going to maximize what you're doing and be accountable for it. So, for example, if you think you want to donate to the Kansas Food Bank, which feeds boxes of food to all these pantries in town, one of the things they've told me is that if you give them a sack full of canned goods, good, but if you give them money, they have these agreements with all the companies that give them their food, that sell them their food, that it's extremely cut rate. So they can literally if you give them $1, they can turn it into $10 worth of food. And this is key in the schools in the following way. One of the other stories that horrified me in my time here is when the food bank started the backpack program. The reason they started that is they'd gone out, fanned out into the schools and talked to teachers and parents and kids. And there were all sorts of schools where kids were coming on Monday morning just frantic. They couldn't concentrate. They were shaky. They were stealing, getting into other kids' property and lockers and stealing food. And they realized there's hundreds of kids in this town who don't eat in the school year on weekends. Or they do eat, but it's the cheapest possible, I don't know if you could even call it food. It's really cheap potato chips and really cheap soda pop, which when you know what makes up a potato chip, it's starch, which is sugar, and it's sugar in the pop. And so they're not only hungry and malnourished, but they're just frantic and they've got headaches, and there's not a lot of learning that goes on there. So the food bank created the backpack program where they go to quite a few of the schools, not all of them, but quite a few of the schools in the metropolitan area, not just Wichita. And they make sure there's a backpack for each one of these kids so that they can take it home. And there's enough food in there to feed not just a kid for a weekend, but a family if they ration it out pretty well. And it's not potato chips. It's cheap. It's like peanut butter and stuff with protein in it, so they're not going to get a sugar buzz and go off and be, a little kid on a sugar buzz. So there are things that I think I've come across that can be done. There's no way that we're ever going to solve all of this. There's never going to be a time when there's not homeless people. But I guess the way I want to wrap this up is that because of the nature of what I do and who I am, I sort of live in two worlds. There's plenty of my friends who are Democrats and liberal, and I've spent a lot of time with them up close and personal, and most of them are really good people. Same thing with the conservatives, including the people who make fun of me. Those two brothers that are just so like this on me, they're both police officers at separate ends of the state, and they're heroes. They have been shot at, both of them. They have been in hand-to-hand combat with meth heads and jerks and people who sell meth from their house while their kids are going hungry and walking barefoot outside in the wintertime. They have done stakeouts on drug houses where they've got, a really heavy coat on in the middle of winter and strong binoculars to just sit there for hours and watch and sit on a house like that and figure out what's going on. So whenever I hear somebody bashing people who, like Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity, or who are conservative and gun owners like my two brothers, they both have AK-47s, by the way. I hope you all feel safe. I get mad when people criticize conservatives like that because they're talking about my family. At the same time, I get a little testy when people criticize liberals, because those are a lot of friends of mine who do good, nurses, teachers who go way beyond the call of duty, people who have saved lives, people who have turned people around. So I think what I want to wrap up with is just to say we probably need to do a better job of trying to get away from the generalizations and the name calling and try to figure out what's really going on. A lot of the folks here have no idea. I still get this whenever I do a story about the homeless kids in the schools. People call me up and they're just really upset. I had no idea that there's this going on. How is this even possible? What that also means, of course, is, well, they're not reading the Wichita Eagle because I've written about it a lot. Maybe I'm boring when I write those stories. I don't know. Okay, enough of me. Does anybody want to ask me any questions?
I'd like to make a comment before I ask you some questions. I've had personal experience with what you're talking about and been helpful to some individuals in that regard, but I've never done it through an organization. I'm aware of the school in Oaklawn at Barry Downing built, which is preparation for this. And I would make a comment that I think that's probably the best avenue. I can speak from the perspective that I grew up in Plainview, so I've been poor and I've been rich. And so I think I have a real, shall I say, in-house perspective on it. And I would say Barry Downing is right on track with what needs to be done. Because frequently, without teaching people values and particularly a skill, they tend to gravitate to drugs and alcohol, and that's many times their downfall. Now, I know a couple, one I currently work with, that goes to the homeless shelter, etc. And the basic problem there is that they are on, shall I say, addicted to alcohol or drugs. They may not do it while they're there. So my question to you is, what have you determined you think would be a positive thing to do? And do you feel that the Barry Downing approach is probably one of the best ways to go in general?
Well, I'm not quite sure how to answer your question other than I really do think Barry Downing is onto something. The other general suggestion I would make is, if you're interested in any of this, please do the hard work of actually trying to find out what's really going on. Most people don't do that. Most people don't know, and so they make assumptions about people. I use the example about me for a reason, because I work at the Eagle. Is anything I say therefore suspect? Is it fake? Don't do that. It's painful. Find out what's really going on. It was a real eye-opener for me to actually see, for example, 6 years of covering courts in Wyandotte County, Kansas, my first 6 years when I'm in my early 20s, about how vicious some criminals are. That completely turned me around, because I actually saw and heard with my own senses what's going on out there with a certain bunch of people. They're just people who are just mean and cruel and egotistical. BTK being another example. I've spent years covering that guy now, including trading letters with him, and there are some people who are just unredeemably evil. That guy and a lot of other people in our prisons today cannot be rehabilitated. But my larger point in answering your question is, it's hard work to go out and find out what's actually going on, but that's the way that you can make better decisions about anything that you do. Does that,
What would you think of the perspective of each individual or family maybe helping one person? You know, that's something.
the question is, maybe each one of us could consider adopting, is that the word, adopting one family or one person to just help them? Yeah, people have done that. And that's probably a good way to go, and be sensible about it. It's not easy to figure out. A lot of these people, as I have said, are working families who, because of a lack of education and a lack of good role models growing up, end up in these bad situations. Some of them, I don't think the majority, but some of them have addiction problems. I'll just say right now that I have spent years now attending other meetings with lots of people in the room where the first thing I say when I stand up is, "Hi, my name is Roy." You know what I'm talking about? Well, that's a hell of a compulsion, and most people don't have it. When I realized I'm an alcoholic and need to just cut completely out all the drinking stuff, man, I learned a lot, and most addiction doesn't happen just because you've had trauma or poverty in your life. I've interviewed dozens of police officers, for example, who shot people in this town. Well, some of them took to drink, most of them didn't, because they don't have that, whatever it is, that gene or that genetic disposition like I have, where if I've got a six-pack of beer, God told me I got to get all the way back down to the sixth beer and finish it. That's some sort of addictive compulsion. There are people out on the streets. We turned out mentally ill people. We used to have homes for the mentally ill. We don't anymore. Republicans thought, why should we have to pay for this? Democrats thought, well, you know, those places just, you know, warehouse people and they need to do something different. So it ended up, they're out on the streets. And you know who our mental health workers are now? It's this hell of a thing that takes up an enormous amount of taxpayer dollars. Police officers who a lot of these people self-medicate. So what do you do with them? There's no place to take them. So you got mental illness and drug addiction and alcohol addiction. And if they're shaken, if they're found on the sidewalk lying down, the police take them to the hospitals, which then, even though they've seen this guy 8 times before and they know what the rule is, their own rules are, we can't just assume that he's having the DTs now. We got to do thousands of dollars worth of tests on him, which they then eat because the guy can't pay. We haven't figured, there's a lot of things that we've done in this country that are just freaking admirable. A lot of things that many of you have done in this town that are very admirable. I have the highest respect, especially after my 2 years with Fran Jabera, about how people who own businesses and give people jobs are the engine that keeps us being America. If it weren't for people like you and for people who do that kind of a thing, there wouldn't be any money to help anybody or have a zoo that people want to come to. So I'm not an America basher. I'm very patriotic, but we aren't perfect, and we aren't perfect usually not because we're bad people, but because we're either misinformed or we're too in love with our own assumptions to go out and challenge them.
Back here. So you mentioned that automation is one way that we've been losing the better paying jobs and all. However, I think there was a period in the schools where everybody had to go to college, and they did not teach the hands-on skills. I think they're moving back into allowing kids to do more shop and the hands-on skills now. But I know several handymen that are desperate for someone to help them out with, and that's a higher paying job than McDonald's. So somehow there needs to be or is there a way that there's a clearinghouse, a way to match up some of these people with jobs that are out there that are left unfilled?
I personally, again, I'm supposed to be an objective reporter without opinions, but I think schools made a mistake in getting away from not only wood shop or the VOTEC things, but many other things. I the little town where I grew up in, I went to school at Washington High School. I was surrounded by people who are still my friends today who were farm kids who can just do anything with their hands. And they loved wood shop. They loved cutting up wood. They loved tinkering. And in those days, as you know, you could park a faulty car under a shade tree. You can't do this now. Yank the engine out up on a heavy limb, and I saw friends of mine in the 7th grade helping their big brothers and their dads rebuild engines. By the way, the school district people have told me that it just galls them no end that they had to cut down on not only wood shop but art classes, because they said there's something about guys where their wiring is that they learn better by using their hands. So art class wasn't just some foo-foo thing where they got to play around with colors and expressing themselves. They said a lot of the boys really loved that. Well, what are the music? That's one of the first things that gets cut. Music teaches you to work in a team. You can go to school to learn math. You can go to school to learn how to write a complete sentence and write emails that make sense to your boss. But a lot of those liberal arts things, like art and music, teach you to work in a whole different way. And they teach you to work in an office, for example, or to work with a supervisor, for example. Soft skills, as they're called. So I don't know what to do about that either. I don't think that throwing money at it is going to solve it, but I think the schools have been abused for years by all sorts of people from either side of the political spectrum who have done poorly by them by just creating a situation that they can't fix.
Okay. In your interviews with Heidi, did she allow you to speak with her children?
Oh, yeah.
If she did, what was their perspective on their situation? I know children always have a little different edge on things.
Well, one of them was 1 year old and immediately just crawled up into my lap in the canteen at the Eagle, and I couldn't pry him loose. The mama had to come over finally. But he was 1 year old, and I didn't get a lot of valuable information out of that kid. The other boy was, I think he was in kindergarten. Can't really get much valuable information, including about national politics, from a kindergartner. Although sometimes they say things that are smarter than politicians from either party. But yeah, good kids, very well cared for. She was going to Quick Trips every night to get supper. Go in, bring the kids in, unload them from all that property in the back of her truck. She'd take them in with her and buy Quick Trip food and come back out and they'd eat it in the truck. Does that answer your, okay?
Could you comment on the homelessness in smaller communities and rural communities? I think if I recall from your article correctly, I'm from Chidi, there are 13 kids classified as homeless in our school district. It's got a shot.
The food bank people branched out from Wichita long ago, and I think we've got 100 and some counties in Kansas, and they supply food to, I think, 89 of those counties. The food bank here in Wichita, they let the Kansas City food bank feed the rest, and there might be somebody else involved. But I haven't done many stories about outside of Wichita, but a lot of those people that they help in those smaller communities are elderly, fixed income. They said the classic thing there is fixed income, medical bills, prescription drugs that their insurance doesn't cover if they have insurance, and so they go without food. They go without food. They go to the store and they buy cat food because they love their cat, and they don't buy enough food for themselves. So malnourishment. Also, the really older generation is a generation that doesn't like to ask for help. So a lot of times the food bank people are working with community people out state to try to identify who the needy people are. And in small towns, you kind of know. So lots of times it's not the old people saying, hey, I'll take that box. It's their neighbor, their cousin, their children who can't afford to help out as much as they would like to. So does that answer your question?
Could you talk about the homeless children in rural communities?
I probably shouldn't, and simply because I haven't, they're pretty similar to the situation that you see in Wichita here. Hungry on the weekends because they get to eat at school.
One suggestion is, I think if you use the word vagrant, which is a good word, there are people who want to work and can't, don't have to work, and there are other people who don't want to work. But calling the vagrant a homeless person is really, it's not identifying them correctly. So divide the group. And one other thing is, on the Joe Rice Church, on the downtown church, have you been there with the homeless?
I'm sorry.
Joe Wright, downtown church, anything about it? Have you been there?
I have not. I interviewed, it's Pastor Wright, right? He and Terry Fox, another pair, very, very conservative people who have done a tremendous amount of good for the poor in this town. It's like this incredible passion with those two. The first time I met him, Terry took me into the church that it was his church at the time and took me through it was like a freaking warehouse of all the clothing and food and kids' shoes that he and his fellow church members had gathered. It was pretty stunning. So that's what I know about them.
Last question right here.
Okay?
Sir, the gal with the two kids, sometimes three in that vehicle, where in the world did they find bathroom facilities and take showers and stuff? For crying out loud.
Quick Trips. There was a pit stop every night at the Quick Trip, and they would go in, and every 3 days or so she'd take them in and take the paper towels and use those to sponge off the kids. And she actually had relatives in town, and I didn't dig real deep. Like her mom lives in some town about an hour from here down southwest. Well, why hasn't your mom done more? Well, I don't want to talk about that. Okay, but the mom would sometimes, and then an aunt would sometimes let them in like every 2 or 3 weeks or so, and they would get a full bath or a shower. But usually it was a Quick Trip bath.
Roy Wenzl, let's give him a big hand.